My name is Peter Maguire. In 1997, I created and launched jazz clubs worldwide. The past year or so has been something of an existential crisis for the jazz scene worldwide. Upside or downside, it has, however, provided space and time for reflection. Jazz, My Life, is a non-sequential series of my own personal recollection and thoughts about my own lifelong immersion in the world of jazz. If you feel inclined to do so, please click on the subscribe button and the notification Saxman icon. Many moons ago, the BBC had a programme called Jazz 625. The concept was really very simple. You had a jazz group, usually top names from international names. It was introduced by Humphrey Lyttelton, the late Humphrey Lyttelton, and you had an audience. The camera just pointed itself at, well, the cameraman pointed the camera at the band and zoomed in if somebody was talking, etc., etc., and the occasional shot of the audience, particularly when they were applauding at the end of a number. A simple concept, but very effective. You can also find American television programs from the same era who followed exactly the same scenario. But what happened? This simple concept is no longer used. Quite a long time ago, I actually did a program for the BBC on what was Radio 4. Nothing to do with jazz. It was actually about a Chinese missionary. Anyway, it was featured as Programme of the Week in The Listener, which is now defunct, and the Radio Times, and got quite a lot of publicity. And this really gave me an intro to be able to contact people in the BBC in a way that I hadn't done before. So I remember, in fact, making a suggestion that, in fact, the BBC should perhaps consider doing a programme called Jazz in Leeds. At that time, Leeds was a very dynamic as far as jazz was concerned. It had the first of the jazz schools, and there were many venues and a lot of very good musicians around. They thought about it, and it was shelved effectively. Almost at the same time, I was invited to discussions at Channel 4 to discuss the possibility of doing a programme about jazz in the provinces. That's the United Kingdom provinces. And I went along there with my friend Dennis Wolfe, who was a long time in television. Used to work for Granada on Granada Television. I've forgotten the name of the programme now. Anyway, Dennis and I went down to London, and we had discussions with a commissioning editor from Channel 4, who in tandem had a youngish guy who turned out to be a filmmaker from the London Film School. It became obvious very soon that this commission editor really was totally metropolitan focused. He wasn't, I don't know that he was really interested in jazz, frankly, but he certainly, it was obvious he couldn't see any kind of value in doing a programme about jazz in the provinces of the UK, which was very sad indeed, because there was a lot of bands all over the country and some very good musicians. I mean, amateurs, semi-professional some, but there was it was really, it could have been a very interesting project. And then we got to the nub of the matter, that he was promoting the interests of this young filmmaker, who eventually produced a movie television programme about the Soho Jazz Festival, which frankly the jazz content was almost minimal. And this to me in fact heralded a real change in the attitude of jazz, certainly on television. You have to remember that the BBC in those days the people who were interested and produced programs on music tended to be obviously graduates, usually Oxbridge, but jazz was a very significant cultural aspect of university life at that time. I mean, there was an inter-university jazz contest, which is unthinkable now. And of course, as these people were elevated to higher positions and new people came in from the universities, but for them, jazz had not played any real part in their university experience. In fact, you could see now that the people who booked bands, which appeared usually at the student union, in fact, rarely thought of a jazz group, and you got the early days of, I don't know, people like the Stones and various up and coming bands. So jazz was put on the back burner. So now anybody producing a jazz program, the simple concept and the effective concept of having a band and a camera that does not zoom in and out or do anything other strange things, and occasional view of the audience, this is really not acceptable. It's a generation, in fact, who are more influenced by what happens on the popular music scene. So jazz is seen not to be able to stand alone. So you get complete aberrations, such as the hilarious proceedings at the proms, where in fact you had two big bands competing against each other with a presenter and, would you believe it, a bell which you would ring from time to time. Totally absurd. Achieve nothing. I mean, you might suggest, okay, you have two classical orchestras and you have Shostakovich on one side of the stage and you have, I don't know, Chopin, no, not Chopin, Rimsky-Korsakos on the other. They never think about that, but jazz, oh no, this can't stand alone. It's got to have some kind of a hook to attract people. For instance, there was quite a lengthy program, in fact a week, of a famous, very famous jazz club in London, and they recorded it every night. But once again, it couldn't stand alone. They dug up some so-called jazz poet who actually put in his contributions nightly several times. Completely superfluous. It was not necessary. And frankly, it's continued from there. And we've got a situation now where, in fact, hype plays an enormous part in the way jazz, when it is presented at all, is presented. I read The Guardian. I've read The Guardian for years. It's my favourite newspaper. But they do regular features on jazz. But recently I just read one, and I have to sort of search for the people they're promoting. And they throw around the word like jazz genius and breaking new ground, etc., etc. And frankly, when you actually look at the work these people are producing, okay, I mean, some of them are very good musicians, but they're by no means representative of what is best or original on the international jazz scene. But they tend to tick the boxes. They have the right profile, they're photogenic. Just as to wrap up the story about jazz in Leeds, 3 or 4 years later, after I made this suggestion, they did in fact make a programme about jazz in Leeds, and what they called it was A Town Like New Orleans. And what they did basically, they didn't look for the best musicians or the best or the most original musicians, of which there were many in Leeds, particularly from Leeds College of Music and around the scene. Basically, they sought out all the freaks, people who were photogenic in a way, visually interesting perhaps, and with the odd exception, musically, absolutely nowhere. And it's difficult now. Jazz just doesn't get a look in, and when he does, it's got like presented in a pop context, so it's more a feast for the eyes. Recently, I watched a programme on, in fact, was part of Jazz Week on the BBC, which featured singers, a big audience and well presented, etc., etc. And the thing about it was this: that first of all, it may be my ignorance, but in fact, I actually knew none of the singers who actually featured on this programme. And before every song, the presenter, she gave a rundown of their curriculum vitae, who they were, where they came from, and last but not least, a big plug for their new and fabulous album. And this took an enormous amount of time. It was almost it took longer than the actual musical context. So personally, I'm a bit sad about it all. I mean, it's just a great pleasure to go back and watch programs like Jazz 625, where you had international names presented in a simple and effective way. And also, if you check on like YouTube, you'll find very good programs being produced, or were produced at that time, in America, with a very similar context: a band, a camera, and somebody who introduced them. But those days are gone forever. It's a truism to some extent that people do listen with their eyes, and the people who commission programs about jazz may or may not like jazz, but they really feel that this isn't a music that can stand on its own. It all has to be presented within a visually dynamic context. And all I can say is tosh.